Well, hello, this is Kerry Herf, and I am pleased to bring you the final lesson in our study on Colossians, which will be Colossians Chapter 4. I hope that this study has been uplifting to you. Certainly, I know that when you're a teacher, especially of leading Bible classes, that the teacher probably gets way more out of the study than the students do. So let me go ahead and share my screen here. And we'll go to presentation mode, hopefully. Slideshow. Yep, here we go. All right, so this is chapter 4. It's the concluding portion of the book of Colossians. And we'll be continuing to see practical applications that Paul is offering to the saints, in addition to some interesting mentions of some of Paul's key companions, and gives us some insight into some of them, both from a positive standpoint as well as a potentially negative, or definitely a negative one too. All right, so as we've been doing for the last 12 weeks, would like you to pause and reflect on how the Lord has blessed you this week, how he has been an influence of good in your life, the gifts that he has blessed you with. So just pause for a moment and consider those, please. And also who we should be praying for. Certainly there's a number of people in the bulletin that we should be praying for. Certainly the Houston family comes to mind, Rick Reynolds comes to mind, and there's a number of other folks, and also our shut-ins, people who are unable to emerge from home. And so please keep those members in your prayer. And as we get into Colossians 4, Paul actually gives us some instruction on prayer. So let's look at Colossians chapter 4, starting in verse 2. Devote yourselves to prayer, keeping alert in it with an attitude of thanksgiving, praying at the same time for us as well, that God may open up to us a door for the word, so that we may speak forth the mystery of Christ, for which I have been imprisoned, in order that I might make it clear in the way I ought to speak. Conduct yourselves with wisdom towards outsiders, making the most of the opportunity. Let your speech always be with grace, seasoned as it were with salt, so that you may know how you should respond to each person. As to all my affairs, Tychicus, our beloved brother and faithful servant and fellow bondservant in the Lord, will bring you information. For I have sent him to you for this very purpose, that you may know about our circumstances and that he may encourage your hearts. And with him, Onesimus, our faithful and beloved brother, who is one of your number. They will inform you about the whole situation here. Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, sends you his greetings, and also Barnabas's cousin Mark, about whom you received instructions. If he comes to you, welcome him. And also Jesus, who is called Justus. These are the only fellow workers for the kingdom of God who are from the circumcision, and they have proved to be an encouragement to me. Epaphras, who is one of your number, a bondslave of Jesus Christ, sends you his greetings, always laboring earnestly for you in his prayers, that he may stand perfect and fully assured in all the will of God. For I bear him witness that he has a deep concern for you and for those who are in Laodicea and Hierapolis. Luke, the beloved physician, sends you his greetings, and also Demas. Greet the brethren who are in Laodicea, and also Nympha, and the church that is in her house. And when this letter is read among you, have it also read in the church of the Laodiceans, and you, for your part, read my letter that is coming from Laodicea. And say to Archippus, take heed to the ministry which you have received in the Lord, that you may fulfill it. I, Paul, write this greeting with my own hand. Remember my imprisonment. Grace be with you. So a couple of key thoughts and sections that Paul goes through. The first, looking at verse 2, verse 3, And then also, speaking about Epaphras in verse 12, Paul says to persevere in prayer. There are times when I frankly feel that my prayers are just staying in the room, but we need to be persevering. We need to always know that the Lord is listening to our prayers, encourages us to pray. Paul says also to be vigilant. I mean, and the Greek word there is to be awake, to be engaged in prayer, not to just, I sometimes talk about, sometimes we pray like wrist shots, like in hockey, just a quick flick and then we're done. But we are to be vigilant and awake and aware of what we are praying for. Paul also says to pray in thanksgiving, that all the things that the Lord has blessed us with, and that's just why we always start our class that way, that we be mindful of how the Lord has indeed blessed us. And then I think Paul makes some other interesting comments and applicable comments to certainly for us to pray for others in a way that can be an encouragement to them, that the Lord might indeed bless them. But then Paul also talks about in verse 4 to pray for the gospel, and specifically to pray for him. So we know that Paul was not did not consider himself a dynamic speaker, and he indeed prays that in order that I might make it clear in the way I ought to speak. So even being imprisoned, even having a Roman guard with him at all times, Paul was still thinking about, how should I speak? How can I present the gospel in a way that the person that I'm talking to will be moved, and that will be drawn to the gospel, drawn to Christ by the message that even the evangelist, the great apostle Paul, was presenting. Paul then goes on in verses 5 and 6 to give us three practical commandments in terms of how are we indeed to deal with those who are outside of the church. Conduct yourself with wisdom towards outsiders. I think our role is to present the gospel where we have opportunity, which is the second commandment or admonition there. But we need to be wise. We need to know when to speak. We shouldn't be shy, but we should be wise in how we deal with outsiders. That we should, again, as we have opportunity, take, as an old coach used to tell me, Kerry, if you have the ball and you're open, take the shot. In the same way, if the opportunity presents itself to present the gospel, we should be always ready to do that. And also that our speech should be gracious. Paul says that your speech should be seasoned with salt. Again, an old preacher friend of mine said, taste every word before you speak it. And again, we are not here to win arguments. We are to be ambassadors. We are to conduct ourselves in a way that represents the Father. And I just added so two passages from Proverbs, which I think are also important for us to remember. In a divisive society that we live in, a politically charged society that we live in, we are, again, not here to make bombastic statements, nor are we to act in a condescending or superior way. But we are to act and talk in a way that is persuasive, that people will look at us and say, what's different about that person? Why is that person acting in a civil way, in a polite way, that ultimately will give us an opening to speak about Christ. Proverbs 16:24 reads, pleasant words are a honeycomb, sweet to the soul and healing to the bones. So again, when we're speaking with outsiders, we are to be act in a way that is soothing, that provides a good taste to those who are listening to us. And then another one that I just picked, Proverbs 22:11, which I think is also appropriate. 22:11, he who loves purity of heart and whose speech is gracious, the king is his friend. So we have influence, and we can have influence with powerful people even. But more importantly, we have influence with the people that we are speaking to and interacting with, who that again supports the command from Paul to be gracious in our speech. Paul then goes into, in the verses 7 through 15, a number of individuals who are still with him in his imprisonment. But the friends seem to be dwindling away, and certainly by the time we get to 2 Timothy, only Luke is left with Paul. So, which must have been a very large discouragement to Paul. And we'll get to 2 Timothy 4 in just a moment. But he goes through a number of people and provides some interesting insights to them. So the first is Tychicus, who's also mentioned in Ephesians 6:21. And wouldn't it be wonderful to be one of the companions of Paul, where through all of humankind, your how you have served the gospel is recorded in the Bible, and aspirational for us to act that way. Again, going back to Colossians 3:17, that whatever we do in word or deed, that we do all in the name of Christ Jesus. So Ephesians 6:21, but that you may also know about my circumstances, how I am doing. Tychicus, the beloved brother and faithful minister in the Lord, will make everything known to you. Can you imagine the compliment of being a beloved brother to the Apostle Paul? Paul also speaks about Onesimus in verse 9, our faithful and beloved brother, who is one of your number. They will inform you about the whole situation here. So Onesimus, of course, we know, was a slave. In fact, even worse, a runaway slave from Philemon. In the book of Philemon, Paul addresses that relationship. But Onesimus has become useful to Paul. He was useless to Philemon, but has become very useful to Paul. And both Tychicus and Onesimus, interesting, if you look at the latter part of verse 9, they will inform you about the whole situation here. Even though we have Paul's letters, Paul still had to rely on word of mouth in terms of sending physical messengers to go and communicate about the circumstances that he was encountering in prison. Aristarchus is from apparently was with Paul at Ephesus. Was part of the crowd when the riot occurred, and he was a companion of Paul and was swept up in the riot there. So Aristarchus in 4:10, my fellow prisoner sends you his greetings, and also Barnabas's cousin Mark, about whom you received instruction. If it comes to you, welcome him. So of the list here, of all these people, I think Mark is probably the most interesting story. As we know from Acts 13, Mark is related to Silas and abandons Paul and Silas when things get tough. And Paul, at the time, was extremely angry with him and refused to take him on the next journey. And in fact, as we all know, that caused the split between Paul and Silas. They apparently never worked again in the gospel. And yet, what a beautiful story of redemption and forgiveness. Certainly, Mark is mentioned here. He's also mentioned in 2 Timothy. We know that 2 Timothy is the last of the letters that Paul writes. And starting in verse 10, or verse 11, excuse me, of 2 Timothy 4. Only Luke is with me. Pick up Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful to me for service. And so, here is someone that just had a tremendous, Paul had a tremendous blow up with. Frankly, Mark could have been unhappy with how he had been treated. Paul also needed to be forgiving of Mark and abandoning the work. And so I think it's important here also to look at Colossians 4 in regards to Mark, because Paul makes this extra mention. About whom you have received instructions. If he comes to you, welcome. Excuse me. If he comes to you, welcome him. So, the word was out. Mark had abandoned the faith, had given up, had fled from opposition. And yet again, Paul was willing to forgive Mark and overlook his past indiscretions because of the forgiving power of the gospel. And Mark made good on that. Mark certainly wrote the Gospel of Mark. Mark was very close with Peter, of course. But what a great story that, especially frankly for Silas. I did a sermon once about the breakup between Paul and Silas, and at that time, Silas could have said, "Mark, we're done. Go back home." Silas stuck up for Mark. There are times when we, as Christians, courageously need to help those who have made mistakes, have committed sins, have not been faithful, but to be an example and to forgive them and encourage them to be useful, just like Mark indeed was. Paul also mentions Epaphras in Colossians 1:7. Unclear if Epaphras is the preacher for these three towns or is the overseer, what exactly his role was, but certainly was a leadership role in Colossians. We know he's mentioned in 1 verse 7, where he's described as a fellow bondservant, a faithful servant of Christ on our behalf. And so, again, Epaphras was the one who told Paul probably about what was happening in the Colossian church. Paul had never had the opportunity to visit that church. Luke, the great physician, is listed in 2 Timothy 4:11, and certainly we see Luke's influence all through the book of Acts, but also see his personal stick-with-itness of only Luke is with me in verse 4 or chapter 4, verse 11. The one person that really doesn't come out well in all this is Demas. Demas is mentioned only in the fact that he is with Paul at Rome or in prison at the time. Unfortunately, we also see in 2 Timothy 4 that Demas abandoned the gospel. Starting in verse 9, make every effort to come to me soon, for Demas, having loved this present world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia, Titus to Dalmatia. So Demas doesn't get a big mention in Colossians. You wonder if Paul sensed that already Demas faith was starting to erode. And again, we don't know because there's no further commentary. One can only hope that Demas, like Mark, repented and turned away. But having loved this present world is some tough words. And so, I want to pause here also, and certainly the parable of the sower is so applicable to our lives here and to Demas. The parable of the sower, the seed is planted among the thorns, and the thorns choke out the good plant. And of course, Jesus said that those thorns represent the cares of this world. Even someone who is in close proximity with Paul, who must have benefited so greatly from the interaction that he had with Paul. We can still be susceptible to loving the world more than the church, more than God. We need to be careful of that. Certainly Judas abandoned the Lord also and betrayed the Lord. And then last, Nymphas is mentioned. Nymphas having a house church. And again, we need to remember that in the first century there weren't church buildings to assemble with. Paul would meet people, faithful Jews who were worshiping besides water. The church would meet in houses or in catacombs, and so we need to be mindful that the persecution and the suffering that the first century church encountered, and the debt of gratitude that we have to the church. So Paul also refers in verse 16 about a letter that is coming from Laodicea. And so a little bit of speculation here. What is that letter? Some believe that it could indeed be another letter that was physically lost. Some commentators believe that it was the letter to the Ephesians that was circulating throughout Asia at the time. Others believe it could be the letter to Philemon. And in fact, there's actually also a fake letter, well, scholars believe is a fake letter, that draws from words, from many words from Philippians and Galatians. But again, just a small piece of interest there. There's some interest in some discussion about what does that Laodicean letter really refer to. And then last, Paul closes with his writing with his own hand. We know that Paul used a secretary many times to write letters to the church. Romans 16:22 speaks to that. Paul says, "Remember my bonds." Remember what being an apostle, being a Christian can mean. It can mean suffering. It can mean that things in this world don't go the way you would want them to. And then finally, he concludes with, "Grace be with you." And so, grace is the impact that the Lord has on us, the joy that we have, the gratitude, the outlook that we have. And so, as I conclude this class, and again, I hope it has been an encouragement to you. Now, I also wish to you that grace, the grace of the Lord be with you. Thank you again. I will probably be teaching another class at some point in the future, ideally with you in the audience. And so again, thank you for spending some time with me over the last quarter reviewing the Galatians, reviewing the class from Colossians. Grace be with you, and bye-bye.